because if Bud Crawford is able to get it done against Errol Spence Jr. this weekend, Bryan, what does that mean for him and what would be next?
I think Terence Crawford right now is a pound for pound number one fighter in the world. Because of everything that he's done and in terms of just blowing his opponents out of the water. I think some people are going to question his resume, and I think there's some fairness to that, but it's not like these fights are close. Kind of like with Roy Jones Jr. in the 1990s when he was beating what people thought was subpar competition for the most part, not necessarily James Toney Bernard Hopkins, right? But even at that point, they weren't the legends that we know them as now. Roy Jones Jr. was beating everyone's ass, though, at that point, up until, Antonio Tarver, John Ruiz, and we get to the early 2000s, and it's a little bit different, and he's never the same once he drops back down from heavyweight to light heavyweight and eventually cruiserweight, and he's getting knocked out a lot. Terence Crawford is not at that stage of his career if he's ever going to get there, but he was, I felt like, similarly dominant just from the standpoint of like how many rounds has he realistically lost during his reign. Like, it's one thing to say, oh, he hasn't fought, high-end competition, but it's also like he's not necessarily in close fights with any of these dudes. Not a single one. Like Khabib Nurmagomedov in the UFC. The reason why I think he has a case for greatest of all time is because he's lost maybe 1-2 rounds in his career. And he's also beaten the best. So Terence Crawford does this, beats Errol Spence, then he's beaten the best. He's beaten the best welterweight of the last half decade or so and cements himself as pound for pound number one, where he may be already. I think that as I just told you in the previous segment we did, Ring Magazine has him at number 3. People question their credibility. I'm going to leave that alone. But there are other pound for pound lists that Terence Crawford will be top 3 in just about all of them. And I think he wins this fight against Errol Spence, he's going to be number 1 on pretty much everybody's list. And should be, especially if it's a convincing win and it's not a controversial one, which I hope that the talk coming away from this fight is really like how awesome this fight was, as opposed to Devin Haney, Vasily Lomachenko, where we should have been talking about how dope that fight was and how close it was, and people were just arguing about whether or not it's a robbery.
I have Bud as my pound for pound number 1. However, I think there's a lot of people that don't. So I think this fight, if he beats Errol Spence Jr., it solidifies him as being the number 1 pound for pound boxer on that list, because I think people always knock Bud's resume. And that's the thing. It's like, but he's knocking dudes out. He's knocked out everyone since he's moved up to the welterweight division. And it's funny because when you're in a lower division and you're moving up, usually you're knocking out dudes. But when you move up, you're not knocking as many dudes out. But that was different for Bud. It's like his power got more aggressive and raw as he moved up, and it was more. I mean, listen, what Bud's been doing in the welterweight division has been crazy. Not to say what Spence has done hasn't, because Spence has been killing dudes too in this welterweight division, right? They're both undefeated. However, I think there's kind of a little bit of hate on Bud, and he kind of has a chip on his shoulder, because I feel like just based off resume, they kind of give it to Spence because of the names. I always go back to that Sean Porter fight. Now, I know it's not the same Sean Porter that Spence fought, but what Bud did to him, picking him apart, breaking him down, getting the TKO victory, it was epic. And then I was like, you can't say nothing about Bud now. You can't say he's not fought nobody. But people still say he doesn't have the resume. So I think if he gets Spence on the resume, not only does it solidify him as being the king of the welterweight division, the king pound for pound number 1 boxer in the world, it also makes him the face of boxing. Let's be serious here. He will be the face. There's not going to be any more talk about who's the face of boxing after this. It's not going to be Canelo. It's not going to be Tank. It's not going to be Devin Haney. It's Bud Crawford if he gets this victory. And I also think as he's getting older, this is one of those career-defining moments in a boxer's career where he could sail off into the sunset and call it a career. I don't think he will, because I think Bud still has a lot in the tank.
That's interesting.
But it's one of those fights where he could do that, and we would be like, man, he's one of the greatest. That's what he would go down as if he had Spence on his resume. So I think for Bud, despite the fact that we're obviously saying, he's pound for pound number 1 on that list, there's a lot of people that don't. So I think, he's going to solidify himself as the number 1, as, the face of boxing. And then there's also that conversation, Bryan, as to what's next. If Bud wins, I'm sure Spence is definitely going to activate that clause. Then we get the rematch, right? Then we get the rematch for this fight. And like I said in the previous segment, if they split the first 2 fights, very, very possible that they're going to want to make that bread and have that trilogy fight.
Honestly, if we go that route, let's say Terence Crawford wins this fight, we get the rematch. Maybe it happens before the end of the year, although
I doubt it. Maybe early next year.
Yeah, it's late July. I'm thinking it's probably like a February type of fight. And then Errol Spence wins that fight. Let's just say that, right? Let's say they're both reasonably tight decisions. There's 116, 112s, 115, 113s, and things of that nature. And it's highly competitive, just great boxing. And there's a trilogy fight. After that third fight, you could see them both retiring regardless of who wins or who loses, because they're both at that point. It's just my opinion.
Yeah, especially when you think about everything that Spence has been through, that horrific car accident, his eye injury. It's like he's still a young guy, but his body has taken so much. It's like if he's done with this if he's done with boxing after these fights, like I wouldn't be mad at it. They could both sail off into the sunset because they're gonna make bread. Like I'm not talking like a little bit of bread, like a couple of slices. I'm talking loaves.
but but I also think that if Terence Crawford, so we talked about Errol Spence potentially moving up to 154 because he's got to do it at some point.
Yeah,
right? I just feel like he's going to do it at some point, and maybe it's the rematch. But I think that if Terence Crawford wins this fight, maybe the rematch for this is at 154. But I think otherwise he's probably maybe he continues to be at welterweight. You brought up the retirement piece. The interesting thing about this is Terence Crawford is 39-0. He'd be a perfect 40-0 if he won. That's why I said the retirement. Yeah, that's why I was annoyed when Floyd retired after the Andre Berto fight at 49-0. But I was like, that wasn't gonna stay like that.
I mean, it's one of those things where like I was upset when Andre Ward retired, but I get why he did it. I get why he did it, but I was like, I think he still has a lot left in the tank. But it's like one of those things that if Bud wins and if he was to retire, I would still be like, I think he still has a lot left in the tank. I don't think Bud does, but he has the possibility to do that. So I think it's one of those things where we're going to find out a lot. These are 2 career-defining moments for both of these boxers, Errol Spence Jr. and Bud Crawford. And here at TheMandatory, we want to know what you think would happen if Errol Spence Jr. beat Bud Crawford. And if Bud Crawford beat Errol Spence Jr., let us know. Drop some comments below. Also, if you like the content, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow. You can also find us wherever you find your audio. And if you got a couple of minutes, make sure to hit that rate and review. Also, leave a 5-star as well. We're going to have more coming up here on TheMandatory. We got a full betting preview on the way. So make sure to keep it locked and make sure to follow us on our social media platforms as well. And if you have any comments, let us know because we love to get your thoughts.